You're still answering emails. You're still hitting targets. You're still showing up. From the outside, everything looks fine. But underneath, something is shifting. Slowly, invisibly. Clarity fragments. Motivation hollows out. Emotional regulation starts costing more than it used to. What if the most dangerous moment in a leader's trajectory wasn't burnout or breakdown, but the long stretch that exists before, when everything still functions, when no one raises a flag, not even you? That is the territory this podcast explores. I'm Alain Coadou, and this is Forge Conversations, a podcast dedicated to the phenomenon I call drift. In this podcast, we explore leadership, pressure, biology, and the hidden mechanisms that shape sustained performance in modern organizations. I'd like you to picture the scene. You're sitting in a perfectly air-conditioned office. You just finished your coffee. Everything feels normal, stable, controlled. And then, a notification appears on your screen. An email from your boss. No subject line, just one sentence. Call me today about your numbers. That's it. And yet, within a fraction of a second, something extraordinary happens inside your body. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing shortens, your stomach tightens, and your muscles are already preparing for impact before your conscious mind has even finished reading the sentence. All this, for a few pixels on a screen? That is both fascinating and slightly terrifying. Because biologically speaking, your body has just reacted as if a tiger had entered in your office. The hormonal cascade is almost identical. Adrenaline, cortisol, sympathetic activation, survival prioritization. The only difference is that there is no predator in your office. There is only an email. This paradox sits at the center of modern leadership. At the Forge, we study what happens when high-performing people remain under pressure for too long, not only psychologically, but biologically. Because many leaders begin deteriorating long before anyone notices, including themselves. Performance can remain externally high, while regulation quietly collapses underneath. That invisible erosion is what I call drift. Drift is what happens when a person continues to function, deliver, perform, answer emails, attend meetings, even succeed. While internally, clarity, emotional regulation, motivation, and physiological balance slowly begin to fragment. And the most dangerous part is this. From the outside, everything can still look perfectly fine. That's what we are going to explore today. Not stress in the vague motivational sense, but the precise biological mechanics of chronic organizational pressure and how the Forge framework proposes a path toward recalibration before collapse occurs. Let me give you an image. Imagine a modern, efficient factory running smoothly at 85% capacity. The machines receive maintenance, the temperature is monitored, production is stable, the system breathes. Then one morning, top management comes and announces, we are moving permanently to 150% capacity. And we are cancelling all maintenance. It's too expensive, too slow. The first few weeks are spectacular. Productivity surges, dashboards explode, results look incredible. Everyone celebrates. But inside the machinery, something very different is happening. The engines are overheating, the joints are wearing down, the seals are beginning to melt. Silently. This is what researchers call the performance illusion. The visible indicators improve, while the infrastructure sustaining them progressively deteriorates. And the collapse often feels sudden only because nobody was looking underneath. This is not an abstract metaphor. This is happening right now inside the nervous systems of thousands of high-performing leaders. So why can a simple email trigger such a biological storm? Because your brain was never designed for organizational ambiguity. It was designed for survival. and survival operates fast, much faster than conscious thought. When that email reaches the brain, it first arrives at a relay station called the thalamus. From there, two pathways activate simultaneously. The first is the slower route, traveling toward the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the rational brain responsible for analysis, language, context, perspective. This is the part that will eventually think, maybe this is nothing serious. But another pathway fires first, a much faster one. That pathway heads directly toward the amygdala, the brain's alarm system. And the amygdala does not read emails. It does not analyze nuance. It detects uncertainty, potential threat, possible danger. And the moment uncertainty appears, it pulls the emergency cord. Which means your body is already preparing for survival while your rational mind is still processing the words on your screen. Call me today about your numbers. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. For most of human history, exclusion from the tribe meant you would not survive. No shelter, no protection, no food. To the primitive brain, social threat and physical threat are deeply interconnected. That explains one of the great paradoxes of modern work. A leadership meeting can trigger biological reactions which were originally designed for predator avoidance. Now here's something important to keep in mind. Stress itself is not the enemy. Acute stress can be extraordinarily useful. The pressure before an important presentation can sharpen your attention. A deadline can temporarily increase your focus. Adrenaline can enhance your performance. That's not the problem. The real danger is chronic activation without sufficient recovery. Think about the energy required simply to appear composed all day. Holding a neutral expression during tension, suppressing irritation in a meeting, responding politely to an email that genuinely infuriates you, remaining professional while you internally feel overwhelmed. Every one of these microsuppressions consumes energy. The prefrontal cortex is continuously regulating emotional impulses from deeper limbic structures, and that regulation is metabolically costly. Glucose, oxygen, neurological effort. It's like driving all day with the handbrake slightly engaged. The car still moves, sometimes very fast, but the wear becomes constant, silent, invisible. And unlike prehistoric threats, the modern predator never fully disappears. The smartphone follows us everywhere. Bedrooms, weekends, vacations, family dinners. The factory never fully shuts down. Selye described this dynamic a century ago in 3 phases. First, the alarm phase. Adrenaline, mobilization, short-term survival activation. Then comes the resistance phase. And this is where things become truly dangerous, because the body realizes it cannot survive indefinitely on adrenaline alone. With constant activation, it will change fuel and switch to cortisol. I want you to pause here for a moment, because this is important. Think of someone you know, or perhaps yourself, who went through an extended period of intense professional pressure, maybe a restructuring, a difficult international assignment, a period of sustained organizational conflict. From the outside, they looked solid, composed, still delivering, but something in their eyes had changed. Their patience was shorter. Small things were landing harder. They were still performing, but something underneath was different. That is what the cortisol phase looks like from the outside. On cortisol, people can continue functioning for a very long time, sometimes years. This is often where drift lives. Not collapse, not burnout, not visible breakdown, but functioning deterioration hidden beneath apparent competence. From the outside, these individuals often look strong. They continue producing, leading, delivering, performing. But internally, something progressively changes. Cortisol begins reshaping the system itself. Inflammation quietly increases, recovery mechanisms weaken, and prolonged exposure even begins to impair the neural connections in the prefrontal cortex, the very region responsible for strategic thinking, emotional regulation, and decision quality. This mechanism creates one of the strangest realities of modern leadership. Highly competent people gradually losing access to the very cognitive capacities that made them effective in the first place. Not because of a weakness of any kind, but because their biological infrastructure is overloaded. A delayed meeting suddenly feels intolerable. A minor frustration becomes disproportionately emotional. Cognitive flexibility narrows, patience erodes. This is not a personality defect. It is accumulated neurophysiological wear. And perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this, people in this phase often do not recognize what is happening, because the denial itself is biological. A nervous system saturated with cortisol interprets slowing down as danger. Rest begins to feel threatening. Deceleration feels irresponsible. Our modern organizational culture often reinforces exactly this pattern. We have normalized permanent overload. We often hear colleagues saying, "I'm completely swamped. I barely slept. I'm buried." We even say it ourselves, right? These phrases are almost worn as status symbols now. Suffering has quietly become associated with importance, and many high-performing leaders unconsciously build their identities around carrying impossible loads. This is why letting go can sometimes feel more frightening than exhaustion itself. So we've followed the pressure from email to amygdala, from amygdala to cortisol, from cortisol to invisible erosion. That leads us to an important question. If you recognize something in what I've just described, not necessarily crisis or collapse, but that quiet feeling that you are running harder to stay in the same place, then the question becomes, is there another way? I don't believe the answer is optimization. I don't believe the answer is resilience in the conventional sense. This is not about pushing harder, enduring more, or building a thicker wall. I believe the answer is recalibration, and that is the idea behind Forge. Forge is the model and framework I have been developing to explore how we can sustain clarity, regulation, alignment, and performance under chronic pressure, before drift turns into breakdown. It is still exploratory, still evolving, shaped by coaching practice, leadership experience, ongoing research. It is also shaped by the reflections and feedback I receive. A forge is not a place where materials are simply assembled. It is a place where they are transformed. Through pressure and heat, through repetition, through cycles of exposure and recovery, over time, that process changes the very structure of the material itself. Human beings are not steel, of course, but under sustained pressure, something structural also begins to happen within us. Forge is not a motivational slogan or a promise of perfect balance. It is an evidence-informed attempt to better understand how sustainable excellence might actually work in the real world. The framework unfolds through 5 interconnected movements: focus, overcome, reinvent, grow, and excel. It is not a sequence of rigid states, but 5 dimensions for recalibration under sustained pressure. The first movement is focus. Focus consists in the recovery of something that chronic pressure slowly and quietly steals from us: our ability to know what really deserves our presence. Under chronic pressure, everything is competing for cognitive priority at the same time: performance, relationships, uncertainty, identity, and responsibility. The nervous system gradually loses hierarchy, and everything starts feeling equally urgent. Imagine yourself learning to juggle. At first, you desperately try to track every ball individually. Your attention fragments, everything feels urgent at once, and inevitably, the rhythm collapses. With experienced jugglers, it is different. They do something different and a little strange. They do not follow each individual object. Instead, they stabilize their eyes on a fixed point in front of them. Paradoxically, that is when everything becomes fluid. Focus inside Forge is not related to productivity optimization. It is an attentional realignment and the ability to answer that question. Among everything consuming my energy right now, what truly deserves my presence? This question can sound a little destabilizing because gaining clarity implies choice. Choice sometimes means recognizing that certain ambitions, certain roles, or commitments no longer belong to the person you are moving toward. When working on focus, you will discover that recalibration is not mainly about discovering what matters. It is more about accepting what no longer does. When that realignment begins, something shifts, not just psychologically, biologically. Your diffuse internal tension will start to decrease because your nervous system no longer tries to simultaneously sustain incompatible directions. Your attention will slowly return to an anchor point. Through this phase that I call focus, your energy levels, clarity, and presence will return to baseline. The background noise that has been consuming you will quietly reduce. That is what focus restores. The second movement is overcome. Most people imagine overcoming as pushing harder, improving our endurance, having more discipline, being more resilient. But often the real problem is not a lack of strength, it is unconscious accumulation. Imagine carrying a backpack full of stones for so long that you no longer notice the weight. The burden has become your identity. We have all heard this in our work environments. I'm reliable, others can count on me, I am the strong one, I am the one who handles everything. But what is the burden exactly? It is tempting to point at the workload. The volume, the deadlines, the demands, those are real. But they are not the deepest weight. The real burden is the energy we spend maintaining a version of ourselves that chronic pressure has already made obsolete, but that we still cannot release. Not all burdens are harmful. Some challenges strengthen us. They develop capacity. They deepen us. But some forms of pressure are different. Here are a few examples. Inherited expectations, the roles others assign to you that you eventually internalized as identity, or obsolete loyalties, the commitments that once made sense but no longer do. Also permanent over-responsibility, the compulsion to be the one who holds everything together. All of these patterns consume emotional energy every day, while they no longer create anything essential. Overcome begins by opening the backpack. So instead of asking, how do I push through this? We must ask, what exactly am I carrying? And why do I still carry it? Sometimes the most courageous act is not endurance. It is release. Carrying these burdens preserves a familiar identity, and letting go introduces uncertainty. This is why many of us remain attached to exhausting patterns long after they have stopped being useful. Not because we enjoy suffering, but because our identity has become fused with the burden itself. When we begin to set those stones down, something changes. Energy returns, not because we found more strength, but because we finally stopped spending it on weight that was never ours to carry. The third movement is Reinvent. And unlike what popular culture tends to suggest, Reinvent is not about becoming someone else overnight. It is about intentionally redesigning the way we operate, because the world we now navigate is far more complex than the one that originally shaped us. Focus helped us clarify what truly matters. Overcome helps us release the unnecessary burdens consuming our energy. Reinvent begins after that. Once enough space has been created, a different question emerges. What new capacities are now required from us? Because at a certain stage of life, success no longer depends only on effort, endurance, or technical competence. It increasingly depends on the quality of the internal systems through which we think, regulate emotion, make decisions, recover energy, build relationships, and define success itself. This is the entry point of Reinvent. Think of an operating system that was exceptionally effective for a previous generation of challenges, optimized for speed, responsiveness, execution, and for years it worked remarkably well. But environments, complexity, and responsibilities evolve, and eventually the limitation is no longer our commitment or effort. It is the architecture of the system itself. Reinvent is the deliberate process of upgrading that architecture, not on the surface but structurally. It means revisiting the assumptions we carry about performance, control, value, and success. The invisible operating logic that quietly shapes our decisions every day. It means developing new forms of emotional regulation, so the nervous system is no longer trapped in permanent activation. It means redesigning how we make decisions, how we recover, how we relate to others, and also the environments and structures around us. Because the strategies that once created success are not always the ones that sustain long-term coherence and fulfillment. At some point, progress no longer comes from doing more. It comes from operating differently. Reinvent is the moment we stop asking, how do I keep optimizing the same system? And begin asking, what kind of system do I now need to build to sustain the future I want to create? The fourth movement is grow. Growth here does not mean doing more, pushing harder, or constantly expanding. It means rebuilding the ability to perform well without paying the hidden biological and emotional cost that was accumulating before. This is what makes grow different from the earlier movements. Focus created clarity. Overcome helped us release unnecessary weight. Reinvent redesigned the system itself. Grow is what becomes possible once those foundations are in place. Because chronic pressure does something dangerous over time. It trains us to function through tension, urgency, and stress chemistry. The system slowly learns to perform because of the pressure, not despite it. This creates a paradox. When the pressure finally reduces, performance does not always return immediately. Sometimes we feel flat, unfocused, even strangely uncomfortable in calm environments. This tells us that something deeper now has to be rebuilt. Grow is that rebuilding process. Part of that rebuilding means teaching the system that performance no longer requires emergency. It means rebuilding recovery rhythms and reconnecting with internal signals that chronic pressure taught us to ignore. Gradually learning to function with clarity, intensity, and presence, without depending on urgency, fear, or cortisol to activate them. Once gone through the grow stage, gradually energy begins to return naturally, without requiring a crisis to mobilize us. We no longer need adrenaline to think clearly. Being present with other people stops feeling exhausting. Results still matter, but they are no longer tied to fear, urgency, or permanent tension. This phase also changes the way we relate to pressure itself. A sponge absorbs everything until it becomes saturated. A rock absorbs nothing and eventually stops adapting. Sustainable performance is neither. It is permeability, the ability to remain open to pressure, emotion, and complexity, without becoming consumed by them. But perhaps the most important thing about grow is this. It requires recovery. Sustainable performance cannot rebuild under permanent cortisol load, which means accepting a slower rhythm for a while, accepting that not everything will immediately feel optimized, allowing the new operating mode, time, to stabilize. For many high performers, this is a hard stage because it requires patience with a process that cannot be rushed. And finally, excel. Imagine a concert pianist. During certain movements, the intensity is extraordinary. Precision, emotion, total presence. But between movements, the pianist stops, breathes, recovers equilibrium, then rises again with the same intensity for the next movement. That rhythm is precisely what allows excellence to endure across the entire performance. Without it, collapse eventually becomes inevitable. Many of us reach high performance through chronic overactivation. And ironically, the very qualities that make us exceptional, commitment, discipline, high standards, deep responsibility, are often the same qualities that slowly drive erosion. Because performance built entirely on permanent intensity eventually damages the very regulation that sustains it. But Excel in Forge is not simply about managing intensity more wisely. It points to something more fundamental, a transformation in the nature of performance itself. There is a version of performance built on urgency, on cortisol, on the unconscious belief that if we slow down, something will collapse. That version works, until it doesn't. And it leaves a recognizable signature, performance that depends on pressure to activate. Excel is what becomes possible on the other side of that. Performance that no longer needs urgency as its fuel source. Performance that remains intense, demanding, and ambitious, but no longer internally violent. This transformation does not happen through motivation alone. It happens through repetition. Repeated experiences where intensity no longer depends on fear. Repeated decisions aligned with deeper values instead of immediate survival. Repeated cycles of effort and recovery that gradually teach the nervous system a different relationship with performance itself. This is the stage where regulation stops feeling like effort and starts becoming identity, where the new operating mode no longer feels artificial or forced. It simply becomes the way we function. The internal signal that tells us we have reached this stage is not achievement. It is coherence. What we do, how we do it, and who we are finally stop pulling in different directions. Presence becomes steadier. Decisions become less reactive. Relationships become less transactional. Because we are no longer spending enormous amounts of energy managing the gap between internal survival and external performance. And this changes the environments around us. Regulated leaders regulate systems through the way they work, pause, decide, or through the way they recover. Their presence quietly gives other people permission to function differently too. And over time, that becomes legacy. Not only titles or quarterly results, but the environments created, the people steadied by our presence, and the patterns of leadership carried forward long after we leave. So that is the full picture. And so we return to the email, to the amygdala, to the cortisol, but perhaps now with different eyes. We began with an email triggering a biological storm and followed that storm through the nervous system, organizational culture, chronic cortisol exposure, identity fusion, and invisible erosion. And then we explored what Forge proposes in response. Not a quick fix, not optimization for exhausted people, but recalibration. Focus, recovering attentional clarity, overcome, releasing unnecessary burdens, reinvent, redesigning the system itself, grow, rebuilding sustainable performance, excel, performing without urgency as the fuel source. And perhaps the most important realization underneath all of this is simple. Protecting a leader's biological and psychological infrastructure is not a luxury. It is the condition of durability itself. We cannot demand permanent high performance from human systems while simultaneously neglecting the mechanisms that sustain them. And one final thought. Our nervous systems evolved over tens of thousands of years. Organizational expectations now evolve quarterly. The gap between human biology and organizational acceleration is widening dramatically. And as artificial intelligence transforms work, the pressure on human leaders may not decrease, it may intensify. Because what remains uniquely human will increasingly become presence, clarity, discernment, emotional regulation, meaning-making, and relational stability. This means the ability to remain grounded under pressure may become one of the most valuable leadership capacities of the coming decades. Not soft or secondary, but foundational. So perhaps the real question is no longer, how much pressure can a human being endure? But rather, what kind of human regulation must organizations learn to protect if sustainable performance is to remain possible? And now, go check your next email. It could be your boss. I'm Alain Coadou. I created The Forge because I believe that what happens before breakdown deserves as much attention as breakdown itself. That drift is absolutely not a weakness. It is what pressure does to human beings over time. I believe the ability to recognize it early carries something rare, the ability to sustain not just performance, but ourselves. If you recognize something of yourself in what we explored today, perhaps that's where the real work starts. And if you'd like to explore what recalibration might look like in your own context, you'll find me at alaincoadou.com. This was Forge Conversations. Thank you for listening.